He had nothing. No home, no fortune, no place in the world. People passed him every day without a second glance, dismissing him as invisible. But one night, fate shifted. From the penthouse above, a billionaire's cry for help pierced the silence, echoing through the city like a desperate secret. No one moved. No one cared. Except for him. A homeless black man who had already lost everything suddenly realized he might be the only one who could save the man who seemed untouchable. With trembling hands and unshakable resolve, he whispered 3 words that would change both their lives forever. "I can fix this." The city never slept. Its towers stretched into the sky, glowing like beacons, while its alleyways remained, hidden in perpetual shadow. For those who lived at the top, the penthouses, the boardrooms, the skyscrapers with glass walls, the city was a kingdom of opportunity. For those below, it was a cage. Among the forgotten souls wandering its streets was David Carter, a man once full of promise but now stripped of nearly everything that once defined him. He wasn't always homeless. In another life, David had been a mechanic, a fixer by nature, someone who believed every broken thing deserved another chance. Whether it was a rusted-out car or a struggling friend, he'd say with quiet confidence, "I can fix this." But life wasn't as simple as engines and gears. A series of tragedies had dragged him down. A lost job when his repair shop was bought out by a large corporation, medical bills after his mother's illness, and then eviction when he couldn't keep up with rent. Piece by piece, his world collapsed. Soon, the man who once wore grease-stained coveralls and owned a modest home found himself pushing a shopping cart down cracked sidewalks, his belongings reduced to scraps. Yet even in his state, there was something about David that refused to die. He kept a small notebook tucked in his jacket, filled with sketches and ideas, dreams of inventions, notes on how to fix machinery he'd seen on the streets, even thoughts about rebuilding his life. People dismissed him as another homeless man, but those pages carried his hope. Across the city, high above David's crumbling reality, lived Alexander Royce, a billionaire whose name was carved into buildings, whose empire stretched across continents. To the world, he was the embodiment of success, polished, powerful, untouchable. His life looked perfect: luxury cars, lavish parties, endless headlines that painted him as invincible. But behind closed doors, Alexander was unraveling. The pressure of maintaining his empire weighed on him like chains. Lawsuits, betrayals from trusted executives, and the crushing loneliness of wealth gnawed at his spirit. He had everything money could buy, but nothing that gave him peace. Nights were the worst. Empty halls, echoes of his own thoughts, and a silence so heavy it became unbearable. It was on one such night that 2 worlds collided. David had found shelter near the edge of the financial district, where skyscrapers loomed overhead like monuments to lives he could never touch. He huddled against the cold, clutching his worn jacket tighter, his stomach aching with hunger. Above him, lights glowed in Alexander Royce's penthouse, where the billionaire paced his floor like a man haunted. From the street, David could see a shadow moving back and forth against the glass wall. He thought little of it until a sound shattered the stillness, a cry, a sharp, desperate, almost primal sound that carried through the night. David froze. His instincts sharpened. He had heard cries before, from people overdosing in alleyways, from men in drunken fights. But this was different. This was fear, desperation. Someone far above, someone untouchable, was suddenly vulnerable. The world rarely noticed men like David. Yet in that moment, his gaze locked on the glowing window, and he felt something stir inside him. A truth he had always believed: broken things can be fixed. Even broken people. He didn't know who was up there. He didn't know the weight of Alexander Royce's empire or the chaos of his mind. All David knew was that someone needed help, and he couldn't turn away. This is how stories like these begin, not with power or wealth, but with an unseen thread connecting two strangers in the silence of the night. One, a man who had lost everything yet still carried hope. The other, a man who had gained everything yet still carried despair. And fate was about to pull that thread tight. David's world life on the street had hardened David, but it hadn't broken him. Each day was a fight for survival, finding food in shelters that sometimes turned him away, dodging groups who mocked or harassed him, protecting his few possessions from being stolen. Yet despite this, he held on to a stubborn kind of dignity. He never begged with a sign. Instead, he offered help wherever he could, fixing a broken bicycle for a kid in exchange for a sandwich, repairing a busted heater for a small store owner who later let him sleep in the back room for a night. To David, usefulness was survival. If he could fix something, then maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as invisible as the world made him feel, but nights were the hardest. When the city's noise faded, memories crept in. He'd think about his mother's gentle voice, about the small garage he once owned, about the words he used to say so easily. I can fix this. They used to mean everything. Now they were almost a whisper of a forgotten self. Still, that night, when he heard the cry above, those words returned, not as a memory, but as a call to action. Alexander's world. Alexander Royce lived in a fortress of glass and steel, yet he was imprisoned by it. Success had made him untouchable, but isolation had made him fragile. The higher he climbed, the fewer people he trusted. He thought about the empire he had built, the rivals waiting for him to fall, the headlines that would devour him if they smelled weakness. Every night, his chest grew tighter, his thoughts darker. He didn't trust friends. Most were opportunists. He didn't confide in family. His fortune had fractured those ties long ago. And so, on that night, when the weight became unbearable, he let the cry escape. It wasn't planned. It wasn't controlled. It was the sound of a man breaking under his own empire. But little did he know, someone was listening. The invisible witness. David tilted his head, straining to catch more. His pulse quickened. Most people would dismiss it. Most would think, not my problem. But David had spent years on the edges of society, where people's pain was ignored. He knew what it meant to feel unheard. He stood, brushing the dust from his jacket, his eyes never leaving the lit window above. Somewhere in that tower, someone powerful was suffering, and somehow, David knew this was the moment where everything could change. Because even in his lowest state, even when the world had discarded him, David still carried one truth in his soul. I can fix this. And with that, the story begins. The night David heard the cry, he couldn't sleep. Even after the window went dark, the sound replayed in his mind, as if the pain belonged to him. The city moved on. The taxis, the drunk, laughter in the streets, the police sirens in the distance, but David sat frozen, his thoughts burning. Who cries like that from up there? He whispered to himself. That building wasn't for people like him. It was where wealth insulated itself from the world below. Whoever lived there had everything. Everything David didn't. But the cry told another story. That money, power, and glass walls couldn't protect a man from himself. By morning, David couldn't shake it. He wandered toward the base of the tower, looking up at its gleaming sides. He saw businessmen in polished shoes stepping through revolving doors, women in tailored suits speaking into earpieces, chauffeurs waiting beside black cars. The building looked untouchable. Still, David's instinct pushed him closer. The first step security was tight. Guards in crisp uniforms stood watch, eyeing everyone who entered. David lingered on the sidewalk, careful not to attract attention. He wasn't planning to storm inside, not yet. He just needed to know more. By chance, he spotted a delivery truck unloading crates of bottled water. Workers pushed carts toward a side entrance. David noticed one struggling with a loose wheel, the cart wobbling, threatening to spill its load. Without hesitation, David rushed forward. "Careful, man," he said, grabbing the cart and steadying it. With a quick twist of his hands, he adjusted the wheel, locking it back into place. The worker blinked in surprise. "How'd you do that?" the man asked. "Just needed a little fix," David replied with a faint smile. The worker gave him a nod of gratitude and pushed forward. But the brief exchange had done something more important. It had allowed David a glimpse past the guarded door. He saw the service corridors, the back hallways leading into the tower. For the first time, he realized maybe he could get inside. Over the next few days, David returned to the area. He didn't draw attention to himself. Instead, he watched patterns, which guards rotated shifts when deliveries arrived, which doors stayed unlocked for minutes at a time. His mind worked. Like the mechanic he once was, studying every moving part until he understood how it all fit together. On the third day, opportunity came. A janitorial worker exited the side door, fumbling with his phone and nearly dropping his ID badge. When the man hurried off, David saw it. The door hadn't closed fully. With a deep breath, David slipped inside. The service hallway smelled of bleach and echoing footsteps. He kept his head down, moving like he belonged. Years of being invisible helped him. People rarely looked twice at someone they thought was beneath their notice. Through one corridor after another, David climbed. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but he followed instinct. He wanted to get closer to the voice, closer to the man he had heard that night. Eventually, he reached a floor where the polished marble reflected golden light. This was no service hallway. It was the heart of wealth. He froze, realizing he'd gone too far. He was out of place, dangerously exposed. But then a door opened, and for a brief moment, he saw him, Alexander Royce, the broken billionaire. Alexander looked nothing like the glossy magazine covers. His tailored suit hung loose on his frame. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face drawn with exhaustion. He barked something at his assistant, who scurried away, then pinched the bridge of his nose as if the world pressed too heavily on him. David recognized the man instantly. He didn't need headlines to tell him this was the owner of the building, the empire. The cry he had heard came from this man, the one the world believed was unshakable. For a split second, Alexander's eyes flicked toward him. A stranger in a hallway where strangers didn't belong. David's heart pounded. Security would drag him out any moment. But instead of bolting, he held that gaze, steady and unafraid. And in that look, something passed between them. Not recognition, but something deeper. Brokenness, recognizing brokenness. The assistant returned, and the moment snapped. Alexander turned away, disappearing into a private elevator. But David had seen enough. The chance encounter the next day. Fate intervened. David, walking near the tower, spotted a sleek car stranded at the curb. The driver cursed under his breath, kicking the tire. Steam curled from the hood. Instinct took over. David approached cautiously. "Pop the hood," he said. The driver, frustrated, gestured dismissively. You wouldn't know what to do. But David was already moving, hands confident as he lifted the hood and examined the engine. Within minutes, he had tightened a belt, adjusted a loose connection, and cooled the overheating. The engine roared back to life. The driver gaped. "How the hell?" "Just needed a little fix," David said, wiping his hands. At that moment, Alexander Royce himself stepped out of the building. His eyes flicked from his driver to David, lingering with faint curiosity. "This him?" Alexander asked, his voice low, strained. "Yes, sir," the driver stammered. "Car wouldn't start. He fixed it in minutes." Alexander studied David. He didn't thank him, not immediately. But there was no dismissal either. Instead, he asked quietly, "What's your name?" "David," he replied. A silence stretched. Then Alexander gave a nod. "Come upstairs." Entering the fortress, for David it felt like stepping into another world. The private elevator whooshed upward, taking him to floors he never imagined seeing. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and walls lined with modern art surrounded him. It was surreal, like walking into a dream. Alexander said little as they entered the penthouse. The billionaire poured a glass of water, his hands trembling slightly. David noticed but didn't comment. Finally, Alexander broke the silence. "You fixed my car like it was nothing." David shrugged. "I've been fixing things all my life." "Even when they're beyond repair?" Alexander asked. David hesitated, then answered with the only truth he knew. "Nothing's beyond repair, not if you're willing to try." The words seemed to strike Alexander like a blow. For a moment, the billionaire looked away, his jaw tightening. David wondered what demons were raging in him. The test of trust over. The next week, Alexander allowed David back into his world. At first, it was under the guise of fixing things around the penthouse, an espresso machine, a faulty elevator switch, even a loose hinge on a $100,000 door. But slowly, it became more than that. David noticed the late nights. Alexander spent pacing, the untouched food, the way he clutched at his chest when he thought no one was looking. He saw the strain of a man drowning under the weight of his own success, and Alexander, in turn, began to ask questions. Not the kind billionaires usually asked, but questions that revealed a rare vulnerability. "Do you ever feel like the world doesn't see you?" "All the time," David replied. "Do you ever feel like maybe you're not meant to survive it?" David held his gaze, steady. "That's when you say, 'I can fix this, even if it feels impossible.'" For the first time, Alexander didn't scoff. He didn't dismiss him. He listened. Rising suspicion, but not everyone welcomed David. Alexander's assistant, Evelyn, grew suspicious. She saw David's worn jacket, the calloused hands, the unshaven face. To her, he was a risk. A man with nothing to lose, circling a billionaire with everything to steal. "Why is he here?" she demanded one evening. "You don't know him. He could be dangerous." Alexander's reply was sharp. "He's the only one who doesn't want something from me." Still, Evelyn's distrust planted seeds. Security began watching David more closely. Every time he entered the building, eyes followed. Whispers spread. Who was this homeless man spending time with the untouchable billionaire? For David, it was dangerous ground. One wrong move and he'd be thrown back onto the streets, or worse. But he stayed. Not for money, not for status, but because he saw Alexander breaking. And deep inside, he believed he had a chance to fix him. The turning point one night, Alexander sat on the edge of his penthouse balcony, staring at the city below. The glass of whiskey in his hand trembled. David entered quietly, heart pounding, at the sight. "Don't," David said softly. Alexander's jaw clenched. "You don't know what it's like." "I don't need to," David replied. "I've heard that cry. I've lived in that silence. And I'm telling you, you don't have to end it this way." For a long moment, Alexander didn't move. Then, slowly, he set the glass aside and turned back into the room. It was the first time in years anyone had pulled him back from the edge. And it was the moment David knew. This wasn't about fixing machines anymore. It was about fixing a man's will to live. Building a fragile bond from that night onward, something shifted. Alexander began to open up. Stories of betrayal by friends, the crushing loneliness of wealth, the fear of losing everything he had built. David listened, offering words not of pity, but of resilience. He shared his own story, how he lost everything, how the world discarded him, how he still carried that stubborn belief, "I can fix this." For Alexander, it was jarring. Here was a man with nothing, yet he held more strength than people with everything. And for David, It was a reminder of his own worth, that even broken, he still had the power to help someone else. But neither of them knew that forces were closing in. The assistant's suspicion, the corporate rivals circling Alexander's empire, the world that couldn't fathom why a billionaire would trust a homeless man. The bond they were building was fragile, and it was about to be tested in ways neither could imagine. It began with Evelyn. She had tolerated David's presence in silence, but each day her patience thinned. To her, Alexander was vulnerable, fraying at the edges, and this homeless stranger was exploiting it. At a board meeting, while Alexander sat distracted, she whispered to several directors, "You know about the man in his penthouse. He's homeless. He has no background, no credentials, he just appeared. And now Alexander trusts him more than anyone." The words spread like wildfire. Doubt infected the minds of men and women who measured worth by wealth and pedigree. Who was this David? What hold did he have? Soon the press caught wind. A grainy photo of David entering the skyscraper surfaced online with the headline, "Billionaire seen with mysterious vagrant." The media pounced, speculating on blackmail, manipulation, even extortion. Alexander ignored it at first, but pressure mounted. Investors questioned him. Rivals mocked him. And through it all, Evelyn pressed harder. "You can't keep him here," she insisted one night. "He's ruining your reputation. He'll cost you everything." But Alexander shook his head, his voice low. "He saved me. You'll never understand that." The trap Evelyn didn't stop. If Alexander wouldn't sever the tie, she would force. One evening, while David was fixing a malfunctioning light fixture in the penthouse, security stormed in. 4 men in dark suits surrounded him, their hands gripping batons. "You need to come with us," one growled. David looked to Alexander, who had just entered the room. The billionaire's eyes widened in confusion. "What is this?" Alexander demanded. "We received reports," Evelyn said coolly, stepping forward. "This man has been stealing. Sensitive documents, financial files. He's compromised you." It was a lie, but a convincing one. She held up a tablet showing blurred security footage of David near Alexander's private office. The still frame looked incriminating, though David had only passed by while fixing a door hinge. Alexander froze. For a moment, doubt flickered in his eyes. The seed Evelyn planted was sprouting. David's heart sank. He had fought so hard to be seen, to prove he wasn't just another invisible man on the streets. And now, in the most critical moment, the world was painting him as a thief. A man on trial, they dragged David into a boardroom filled with executives, their faces cold and judgmental. Alexander sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. Evelyn presented her case like a prosecutor, her voice sharp with conviction. "This man has no identification, no address, no references. He appeared out of nowhere, infiltrated this building, and now he sits at the heart of your life, your company. Ask yourself, why? What does he want?" Murmurs filled the room. Some nodded, convinced. Others looked uneasy. David stood silently, shoulders squared, though inside he felt small, crushed by their stares. He could leave now. He could walk away, return to the streets where no one cared enough to judge him. But then he looked at Alexander. The man who had sat on a balcony ready to end it all. The man who had, for the first time, whispered truths he never admitted to anyone. If David left now, Alexander might break completely. So David spoke. The voice of the forgotten. "You want to know who I am?" His voice cut through the murmurs, steady and strong. "I'm nobody. At least that's what the world told me when I lost everything. They didn't care when I slept under bridges. They didn't care when I went hungry. To them, I was disposable." The room went still. But when I saw him, David nodded. Toward Alexander, I recognized something. Pain. The same kind of pain I carried. I didn't come here to take from him. I came here because I heard a cry, and I knew what it meant. He wasn't a billionaire in that moment. He was just a man who didn't want to live. His voice cracked slightly, but he pressed on. You think I want money? Status? No. All I wanted was to fix what I could. Because when you're broken, you cling to anything you can repair. Machines, doors, maybe even people. That's all I've done here. Fix things. Try to fix him. Silence swallowed the room. Some executives shifted uncomfortably. Others avoided his gaze. Evelyn's jaw tightened, fury flashing in her eyes. But Alexander stared at David, with a dawning realization, as if the fog of doubt was burning away. The breaking point, Evelyn slammed her hand on the table. This is manipulation, emotional tricks. Can't you see? He's playing you, Alexander. He's dragging you down. Alexander's eyes snapped to her. For weeks, he had let her speak for him, guide him, control the narrative. But now, something shifted. No, Alexander said firmly. His voice carried a weight that silenced the room. He's the only one who's lifted me up. Gasps rippled. Evelyn's face went pale. Alexander rose from his chair, his gaze never leaving David. When I was standing on that balcony, ready to end it, none of you were there. Not one of you. But he was. He pulled me back without asking for a thing. That's not manipulation. That's salvation. The words hit the room like thunder. For the first time, the power dynamic flipped. David, the man they scorned, had become the undeniable center, public reckoning. But Evelyn wasn't finished. She had anticipated Alexander's loyalty and prepared her final move. That evening, she leaked the story to the press herself. Billionaire controlled by homeless stranger. Cameras swarmed the skyscraper, demanding answers. Investors panicked. Stock prices wavered, and the world laughed at the absurd pairing. Alexander's empire teetered. Yet instead of hiding, Alexander made a decision that stunned everyone. He called a press conference. On the day of the event, journalists filled the hall, eager for scandal. David stood in the wings, uncertain, his chest tight with dread. He didn't want this. He didn't want to be paraded like some sideshow. But Alexander had insisted. When the cameras turned on, Alexander stepped to the podium. His voice was steady, his demeanor fierce. You want to know the truth? He said. Yes. I brought a homeless man into my life. His name is David, and he saved me. The room erupted with shouts, reporters firing questions, flashes blinding. But Alexander raised his hand and continued. When my wealth, my company, my so-called friends couldn't stop me from falling apart, he did. He reminded me of something I'd forgotten. That even the broken can be fixed. That even the invisible matter. You call it scandal. I call it survival. Then, in a move no one expected, Alexander motioned for David to join him at the podium. Reluctantly, David stepped forward. The cameras clicked furiously, but Alexander didn't flinch. This man is not my shame, Alexander declared. He is my proof that humanity still exists, and if you can't accept that, then maybe I don't need your acceptance. Torning. Tide. The impact was seismic. Some investors pulled out immediately, unwilling to be associated with what they saw as weakness. But others saw something different, authenticity in an age of facades. For the first time in years, Alexander Royce was being honest, not polished, vulnerable, not untouchable, and people responded. The media's tone began to shift. Articles appeared. Billionaire breaks silence on mental health. From streets to salvation. The unlikely bond saving a fortune. Evelyn, furious and cornered, resigned in disgrace. Her plan to expose David had backfired spectacularly, and through it all, David remained at Alexander's side, not as an employee, not as charity, but as a friend. The peak of tension. But that night, after the conference, when the cameras were gone and the city lights glowed outside the penthouse, Alexander turned to David with tears in his eyes. You should have walked away when they dragged you in there. Why didn't you? David looked at him steadily. Because I can fix this. I don't quit on people, not when they're broken, not when I hear that cry. For the first time, Alexander didn't just nod or look away. He embraced him, shoulders shaking, the weight of years finally breaking free. The homeless man and the billionaire, two broken souls who found repair in each other, stood at the heart of a story the world would never forget. The morning after the press conference, the city felt different. For years, Alexander Royce's name had been synonymous with cold power, wealth, and a glass tower reputation untouchable by ordinary hands. But now, headlines painted him as something else, human. David woke early, as he always did, his habits, born from the streets where mornings meant survival. He sat by the window, watching the skyline burn with sunrise. Despite everything, part of him still couldn't believe he was here, in a penthouse, his name in newspapers, his face on screens. The same man who once dug through trash bins for scraps was now the subject of global debate. But what mattered most wasn't fame or headlines. It was that Alexander still breathed because David hadn't walked away. A quiet shift, Alexander emerged, exhausted but lighter, as though shedding a weight he'd carried for years. The press conference had been both terrifying and freeing. For the first time, he had spoken truth. Not the version Evelyn had polished for shareholders, not the persona built to intimidate competitors. Just truth. He found David by the window. "They'll never stop talking about us," Alexander said softly. David glanced at him, then back at the skyline. "Let them talk. You're alive. That's all that matters." It wasn't grand. It wasn't flowery. But it was exactly what Alexander needed to hear. The fallout, of course. The world wasn't kind overnight. Commentators mocked Alexander for losing his mind. Investors split. Some cut ties, others doubled down on his newfound transparency. For days, the skyscraper was surrounded by cameras hoping to catch a glimpse of the homeless savior. But while the world buzzed with judgment, something deeper began to stir. Emails poured in. Thousands of strangers wrote to Alexander's company, not about stock or business, but about survival. "I was on the edge too," one wrote. "Hearing you admit it saved me." Another. "I've been homeless for 2 years. For once, someone saw us." What Evelyn had intended as a scandal became a revolution of conversation. Alexander had unwillingly become a voice for both mental health and the invisible poor. And David, though uncomfortable with the attention, was the proof behind the story. Weeks later, Alexander invited David into his office, not the penthouse, but the heart of his empire. For the first time, David sat across from him at the long oak table usually reserved for billion-dollar negotiations. "I've been thinking," Alexander began carefully. "You don't want charity. I know that. You want purpose. So let me ask you this. If you could build something, anything, what would it be?" David hesitated. No one had ever asked him that before. On the streets, survival killed the luxury of dreams. But then he spoke slowly, each word carrying years of buried longing. "A place where people like me don't get forgotten. A place to fix lives the way I fix machines. A shelter, yes, but more than that. Training, work, dignity. So they can walk back into the world standing tall." Alexander leaned back, eyes narrowed in thought. Then, for the first time in a long while, he smiled. "Then that's what we'll build." The shelter of second chances months later, construction began on a sprawling project funded by Alexander but designed with David's vision. It wasn't called a shelter. It was called the workshop. The workshop became a place where the broken were mended, not just roofs over heads, but hands put to work, skills taught, dignity restored. Old machines lined the walls for repair training. Kitchens served meals without judgment. Counseling offices stood beside classrooms. David insisted on being there every day, his hands dirty, his shirt rolled up, teaching others how to fix wiring, patch leaks, rebuild engines. He knew what it felt like to be dismissed, to be invisible. He refused to let anyone in the workshop feel that way, and Alexander. He visited often, not as a billionaire making appearances, but as a man sitting with those who reminded him of the darkness he had escaped, a world watching the media couldn't resist. Headlines shifted again. Billionaire and former homeless man launch groundbreaking program. From streets to shelter, how 2 broken lives built hope. But this time, the attention felt different. It wasn't scandal, it was respect. People across the country donated, volunteered, and advocated. Other cities reached out, asking how they could build their own workshops. For the first time in decades, Alexander Royce's empire wasn't defined by stock prices, but by something real, something lasting. And at the center of it all stood David, the man who once thought he had no worth, now proving to countless others that worth could never be erased. A bond, forged in fire one evening, months after the workshop opened its doors. Alexander and David stood on its roof, watching families below eat dinner together in the common hall. Laughter echoed upward, the IT sound of lives finding footing again. Alexander's voice broke the silence. "You saved me, David. Not just that night. Every day since." David shook his head. "We saved each other." For a long moment they stood in silence. 2 men who should never have crossed paths, a billionaire and a homeless wanderer, now bound by something stronger than money or circumstance. Ripples. Beyond them, the impact didn't stop with the workshop. Corporations began re-evaluating their own policies on hiring and housing. Conversations about mental health entered boardrooms, where they had once been taboo. Young people pointed to Alexander's story as proof that wealth didn't shield anyone from despair. And they pointed to David as proof that no life, no matter how shattered, was beyond redemption. Letters poured in still, from strangers who found courage to keep living because someone had spoken aloud what they had buried inside. And Alexander knew without question that he never would have done it alone. Full circle. 1 year later, on the anniversary of the night David first heard his cry for help, Alexander hosted a small gathering on that same balcony. Not for investors or press, but for the people who mattered. The first residents of the workshop, the volunteers, the staff. He stood at the railing, the city glittering below, and spoke simply. "A year ago, I thought my life had no meaning. Tonight I see more meaning than I ever imagined. And it started because one man, when he could have walked away, said 4 words, 'I can fix this.'" The crowd turned to David, who flushed, uncomfortable with the spotlight, but unable to hide the tears in his eyes. In that moment, he wasn't the forgotten man anymore. He wasn't the invisible one on the corner. He was proof of resilience. Proof that fixing didn't always mean mending machines. It meant restoring people, one broken piece at a time. The emotional impact for Alexander. Redemption wasn't in rebuilding his empire, but in admitting his fragility and finding strength in another's compassion. For David, dignity wasn't in wealth, but in realizing his life still carried weight, that his scars were not shame, but testament. Together, they had rewritten both their stories, and the world, for once, stopped to listen.